Good morning. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this talk in the 2023 Great Decisions series. Our speaker today is Andrew Latham, who will speak on the topic Energy Geopolitics. Andrew Latham is Professor of International Relations and Political Theory at Macalester. He is a contributor to the political website The Hill. His primary scholarly interests are in the areas of international relations and political thought. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota, Global Minnesota, and the Foreign Policy Association. We are deeply grateful to all these organizations. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn things over to our speaker, Andrew Latham, on the topic energy geopolitics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. And it is wonderful to be back. I think this is my third time. Third time's a charm, maybe. I'm going to focus my comments about energy geopolitics today on energy security, which in fact is what the Foreign Policy Association Great Decisions Handbook does. And I want to divide the talk into three segments. I want to talk about energy security during the Cold War. This is from an American perspective. During that post-Cold War era, sometimes called the unipolar moment, when the United States was, of course, the only superpower left standing. And finally, the post-Cold War era, which many people in my line of work are now referring to the era of great power competition. So that's the basic scaffold of the talk, the basic framework or structure of the talk. And throughout, I want to focus on the way in which energy security has been defined and redefined. What are the principal threats or challenges to energy security, again, from a United States perspective? And what are the American strategic responses to those threats? So without further ado, let me kick things off by starting with the Cold War. Cold War, of course, breaks out after the Second World War. It's a titanic, some would say existential struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union for dominance of the world. They both have very different political, economic systems, but they are both heavily dependent upon oil, hydrocarbons, maybe a broader concept that captures both oil and gas. It doesn't really matter whether you're a capitalist factory or a socialist/communist factory, you probably need some form of hydrocarbons. Coal is in the mix, especially during the Cold War, but we see a ramping up of dependence upon fossil fuels like oil and gas. And so during this era, both the Soviet Union and the United States are competing for access to oil around the world. The Soviet Union has plenty of it at home. The United States has some at home, but the Middle East really becomes the focus of the attention of both. The United States desperately wants and needs guaranteed access to Middle Eastern oil. Let me back up just a little bit and say that during this era, Washington defined energy security as reliable and affordable access to energy, almost exclusively fossil fuels, and increasingly over this period, oil and gas. So to have reliable, but also affordable access to energy is key. And because during this era, the United States was the center, as it were, of the so-called free world, the global capitalist economy part of the world, it was also very interested in making sure that its best friends and allies in the world, especially in Europe and Northeast Asia, South Korea beginning to industrialize, Japan rebuilding, and then building what was then the number 2 economy in the world, they need access to oil as well. They don't have oil and gas locally, as much as they need anyway. And so they're all very heavily reliant on Middle Eastern and especially Persian Gulf oil and gas. And what that really boils down to is Saudi Arabia, Iran, which until 1979 was in the American camp on Team America, as it were, and the other Gulf states, Qatar, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, etc. So from an American perspective, securing the Persian Gulf against the Soviet Union in this titanic Cold War struggle for global mastery or domination is really key. And the cornerstone of American energy policy and energy security policy really is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And even before the Second World War ends, President Truman visits Saudi Arabia and says, "Have I got a deal for you? I will promise you security. We will keep the godless communists, the Soviets, out. And in return, you will ensure that we and our friends and allies around the world have reliable and affordable access to your oil." And this is, from the perspective of Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, and Washington, the American capital, this is a deal made in heaven. Everybody gets what they want. And as long as that deal holds, the United States has energy security as it understands it. Because, just to remind people, at this point in history, the United States is a net importer of oil. There's some domestic production in places like Texas and Oklahoma, but it really is reliant on foreign sources of oil. And of course, during this era, the United States is a net exporter of security. It is the cornerstone of NATO, for example, ensuring Western European security. It has troops stationed in South Korea and Japan. It is an exporter of security to Northeast Asia. So again, a kind of a marketplace, as it were. I wouldn't want to push the metaphor too far, but a marketplace emerges in which the United States is a net importer of oil, gets what it wants, and in return, it provides security, especially to those Gulf states. I'll sometimes refer to them as the GCC, or Gulf Cooperation Council. This is an organization that these states put together to look out for their own interests somewhat later in the Cold War, but it's a convenient shorthand. Rather than saying Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, I'll just say GCC, or Gulf Cooperation Council. This is a deal that works really well for the first 2 decades of the Cold War. The Soviets are not able to make any inroads into the region. They have no friends and allies to speak of in the region. The closest are some of their own Central Asian republics, and maybe Egypt. Therein, to quote Shakespeare, lies the rub. This deal worked really well for everybody until 1973. And in 1973, and here's where I can say to an audience like this, you remember 1973, whereas my 18 to 22-year-old students were not born on 9/11. They certainly don't remember 1973, but we all remember the long lines to fill up our gas tanks. What happened in 1973? Well, the United States and Saudi Arabia and the GCC states, Gulf Cooperation Council states, found themselves on the opposite sides of the Yom Kippur War between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And we don't need to get into all the weeds about how that war happened and how it unfolded and who won. All we need to know is that it's at this point in history that OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, is born. Saudi Arabia leads the movement, and the idea is, the West, and especially the United States, needs our oil. We need them to stop supporting Israel in this war and the broader conflict that this war was part of. Maybe we should turn the taps off until the United States and Europe in particular stop supporting Israel and start supporting our side during this war. Now, as you might imagine, this was a profound shock in Washington because it challenged one of these fundamental security arrangements that had worked so well from 1945 to 1973. And it caused enormous economic dislocation, but it really began to change minds. And it really provided the occasion for the United States to begin rethinking energy security. The old arrangement, the old deal, doesn't seem to be working anymore. The Arab-Israeli conflict is not going to go away. The 1973 war did not resolve the underlying issues. Maybe, said the blob, the foreign policy establishment in Washington, maybe we need to think differently about energy security. And they did. And they came up with 3 fixes, as it were. The first was to seek alternate sources of fossil fuel. The idea was to achieve something called energy independence, that if the United States, which still couldn't produce enough oil domestically to meet its needs, could reduce its dependence upon Persian Gulf oil and gas by finding other sources around the planet, then the OPEC would have less leverage. And in any future conflict, if it turned off the taps, the United States and its friends and allies could turn to other sources and say, can you open your taps a little wider? So that was the first reaction. Let's diversify the sources of access to fossil fuels, oil and gas. The second was to begin stockpiling oil on American soil. And it's at this point that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is born. Gigantic lakes of oil, in effect, in various places around the US that are there just in case of an emergency, just in case there's another 1973-like crisis. If you have a big enough stockpile, in the short term at least, if the Saudis turn the taps off, you can thumb your nose at the Saudis and say, we don't care. We have enough in our gigantic reserve lake, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, to get us through, not forever, not indefinitely, but to get us through a short-term crisis. So alternate sources of fossil fuels, stockpiling, these are designed to promote energy security, which again, to refresh your memories, is reliable and affordable access to fossil fuels. That's the definition at the time. There was a third element of this US strategic response to the Saudis turning off the taps. And that was to begin thinking about alternative forms of energy. Now, think all the way back to the 1970s, people weren't talking very much about solar, a little bit, but nothing like we're talking about it today. And they weren't talking very much about wind power. Again, a little bit, but certainly not the way we're talking about it today. So these two so-called renewables really weren't on the radar. What was on the radar, and what seemed to many people at the time to be a perfect solution to the energy security problematic, was nuclear power. If the United States had access to lots of domestic, and if not domestic, North American uranium, which is the fuel for nuclear plants, it wouldn't be dependent upon anybody else other than perhaps our best friends in the world, the Great White North, Canada. And it seemed like a clean and safe form of energy. Between 1973, the Yom Kippur War, the oil crisis, and 1991, which again, to refresh your memories, is when the Soviet Union went away and the Cold War ended, the United States built 32 nuclear power plants. Since 1991, I'll come back to this a little bit later, but I'll just foreshadow a little bit. Since 1991, the United States has built exactly 0 nuclear plants. So again, going back to that era and putting ourselves in the place of American policymakers at the time, nuclear seemed like the magic bullet, the silver bullet, some kind of a bullet, that would solve all our energy problems. And that was the situation then, seeking alternative sources of fossil fuels, including developing as much as possible American sources, reopening wells that had been closed and things like that. stockpiling oil in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and seeking alternate forms of energy, particularly, almost exclusively, nuclear. That was the fix, the strategic response designed to restore energy security towards the tail end of the Cold War. That's chapter one. That's the energy security picture painted from an American perspective as it looked between 1945 to 1973, then 1973 to 1991. And then the Cold War ends. Again, think back, Christmas Day, 1991. The Soviet Union evanesces. It is consigned, to quote Karl Marx, to the dustbin of history. It is no more. At this point, the United States is still thinking about energy security in terms of reliable and affordable access to energy, especially fossil fuels, but renewables have begun to enter into the conversation. Solar and wind, in a minor register, they're not on the top of anybody's or almost anybody's list of things to do, but they're on the agenda in a minor way. And I will remind everybody too that in the aftermath of the Cold War, we went through this phenomenon called globalization. Some would call it neoliberal globalization, but it basically meant that we had, for the first time in a very, very long time, arguably forever, we had a single integrated global marketplace. We had a single integrated global economy. And we had a single integrated global market for oil and gas. When we think back to that time in history, then the United States is pursuing energy security by diversifying, by plugging into these new globalized markets. It's getting its oil, not just from the Middle East and from Canada, which is increasingly new technologies, a different kind of oil, the tar sands, et cetera. Canada is now becoming a major exporter of oil and gas, but that's considered to be, especially after the North American Free Trade Agreement, that's sort of within the United States sphere of influence. But the United States is also acquiring oil and gas from places like Venezuela and Mexico, and really anywhere in the world, because it is a globalized market. It is a single international market, and the US can acquire oil and gas, not just from home, not just from its neighbor next door to the north or to the south, but worldwide. And there has been, at this point, further development of domestic sources. Again, more oil fields being tapped, more domestic sources of oil and gas being discovered. And it has to be said that renewables, the technologies which were only being dreamt of in the 1970s, are now materializing. And we're getting solar and we're getting wind power. But again, these are almost footnotes in terms of where the United States sources most of its energy and what that energy is. Still fossil fuels for the most part. Now, if you think back to the post-World War II, post-Cold War era, globalization is in the air, and along with it, there's an idea of the end of conflict, and the whole world is going to become democratic and free markets and human rights. And we have entered into the bright, sunlit uplands of utopia. It's just around the corner. I heard lots of people talking sort of like that during that era. But there are two developments that also happened during this era, which were destabilizing in terms of American energy security. There were two, let's call them threats, but let's put threats in quotation marks. The first was the rise of China. Now, again, if you think back to this era, Deng Xiaoping, the leader of China at the time, had decided that China was going to become a market economy, not a liberal democracy. Tiananmen Square crushed all that, but it was going to become, it was going to privatize its economy. It was going to enter into the global institutions like the World Trade Organization that were all about free trade, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the beginning of this era, China is poor and weak. It had survived the Cultural Revolution, the revolution before that, the Japanese invasions, the centrally planned economy, Soviet-style centrally planned economy, wasn't working. China is very poor. But once it begins to implement these market reforms, once it begins to internalize this notion that a rising tide raises all boats, and it needs to get on board with this globalization movement, which is largely about the globalization of markets and free markets, et cetera, China begins to become wealthy. It begins to industrialize. And as it does, it too needs energy security. It too needs access to reliable and affordable sources of energy, mostly fossil fuels. It does have a domestic nuclear industry, mostly fossil fuels, for a long time, mostly coal. But increasingly during this post-1991 era, it's looking abroad, because it has very little at home, looking abroad for oil and gas. Now, the simple laws of supply and demand are such that if you have rising demand and pretty much a fixed amount of supply, the prices are going to go up. And that indeed is what's happening. But there's more than that. The United States is looking at China and saying, both for us and for China, prosperity and security requires that we have reliable access to certain sources of fossil fuels around the world. So now we see strategic competition beginning to emerge. This has become important later in the story, but most importantly, we have rising demand. So insecurity of supply and rising demand, rising prices, et cetera. The second development is that during this era, we have the rise of the anti-nuclear movement. It's a powerful movement. It's a deeply embedded cultural movement. It's not just about people in the streets. There is a turning of the tide in the sense that Americans just kind of turn on the nuclear power industry. Between 73 and 91, 32 nuclear power plants are built. After 1991 to this very day, 0. And nuclear power plants are being closed down throughout this era as well. There's a sense that, especially after 3 Mile Island, especially after a little bit later, Chernobyl in the Soviet Union, there's a sense that there's a potentially catastrophic downside to this nuclear energy infrastructure that the US had built. And there's also the problem of what you do with the spent fuel. When the uranium that powers these plants reaches the end of its life cycle, it's highly radioactive, but you still have to get rid of it somewhere. And nobody wanted it in their backyard. There were some plans to bury it places, but then you'd have to transport it. To make a long and complicated and interesting story very short, the nuclear movement, which had been building post-1973, comes to a sudden halt, and it is reversed. So, given all of that, sources of energy in the globalized market, these destabilizing developments that I've just talked about, what did the United States do? What was its strategic response? How did it seek to ensure secure, i.e. reliable and affordable, access to energy? Well, it's at this point in history that we get the beginnings of the shale oil revolution, of fracking and all of that sort of thing, to access previously or hitherto inaccessible oil within the United States, oil and gas within the United States. New technologies were developed, new sources of this hitherto recognized sources of oil and gas. This is the beginning of a revolution that towards the end of this period will result in not merely energy independence, but in a sense, energy dominance. But I'll come back to that in a moment. There's also a ramp up of domestic production, not just the shale oil, not fracking, but just domestic production of oil and gas, offshore often. talking about developing untapped or unexploited resources in the Arctic, but also in the Gulf of Mexico. More steps taken to ensure access to Middle Eastern oil. So 1973 was one oil shock, but 1979 was another, when the Shah is deposed and Ayatollah Khamenei and his people take power. Iran goes from being America's policeman in the Persian Gulf, along with Saudi Arabia, its best friend in the Persian Gulf, to an implacable foe and irredeemable enemy. And so during this era, 1979 to past 1991, 1979, right up until today, arguably, the United States maintains a significant naval presence in the Persian Gulf, carrier strike group and all of its associated ships, actually based in Bahrain, one of the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council states, to ensure, to secure the Saudis, this time not against the Soviet Union, which is no more, but to secure the Saudis against Iran, which for historical, theological, and geopolitical reasons is now in a kind of Cold War with the Saudis. So Iran and Saudi Arabia, on opposite sides of the Persian Gulf, are on opposite sides of a fierce religious and geopolitical competition that spills over into Iraq and spills over into Syria, spills over into Yemen. It's a mess, but the US still, as a strategic response to some of these developments, takes steps to make sure that the old deal with the Saudis, which was a bit wobbly in the 70s, is back. Okay. And again, the strategic response does not involve nuclear power. In fact, it involves a radical de-emphasis on nuclear power. No plants since 1991, a lot of plants closing down. Not really much interest in going down that particular path. And that brings us to the early 2000s. I would say around 2010, 2012, when the unipolar moment, recall now that I framed this in terms of the Cold War, which was the struggle between the Soviets and the United States. Soviets go away, we get the unipolar moment, which is dominated by globalization, by the United States as the only remaining superpower, what our friends, the French, like to refer to as the hyperpower. And now we've entered into, from about 2010 onwards, we've entered into a different era altogether. Multipolar, the return of great power competition, the end of globalization in some ways, but certainly the end of American preeminence or predominance. Because now there is a new, not quite superpower, but it's up there, China. And that changes the playing field in profound and really very interesting ways. I say interesting in the sense that may you live in interesting times is either a Scottish or a Chinese curse, depending on who's telling the story. These are interesting times. Energy security has been redefined. Now recall, during the previous two eras, it was reliable and affordable access to fossil fuels, basically. But now it's been redefined as reliable and affordable access to fossil fuels and renewables, with a growing emphasis on the renewables part. Because the broader political environment has changed, and Americans are increasingly focused on the green, on decarbonization, on climate change, on environmental degradation associated with offshore, potentially offshore drilling. I think back to that BP episode, a good 10 years ago now. That's changed the environment, the political environment. It's changed the context in ways that have resulted in a redefinition of energy security. Fossil fuels are still part of the equation, but nobody can do without them at this point. But the aspiration to be somewhere by 2050 where we really didn't have to rely too much on fossil fuels, where renewables, solar and wind in particular, are the predominant source of energy, that's changed. That's a game changer. It's changed the playing field altogether. So energy security has been redefined in this new era of great power competition. The sources of energy that are available to the United States have shifted as well. Domestic hydrocarbons, domestic oil and gas. Once again, the United States today could be absolutely energy independent. It has sufficient sources of oil and gas, plus a residual nuclear industry, plus increasingly renewables, that it could be, in theory, in principle, it could be energy independent tomorrow. It can also tap into a now fully, in a sense, globalized oil and gas market. So those are the sources of energy, worldwide, domestic when it comes to hydrocarbons, but also this accelerating shift to renewables, although not, to underscore it again for the umpteenth time, not nuclear power. The recent little bit of buzz about thermonuclear power, which is always 10 years in the future, no matter where the starting point is. It's never going to happen. In that new environment in which we have this redefined idea of energy security, and we have this configuration of sources of energy, what are the new threats from an American perspective to American energy security? Well, the first would be choke points. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you look at a map of the world, you can see that, first of all, oil and gas, when it is transported internationally, it's on big tanker vessels, big tanker ships. And if you look at a map, you can see that there are choke points, places that are sufficiently narrow that if something goes wrong, either by accident or by enemy action, that the flow of oil around the world, and it's a global market, so if the flow of oil is interrupted anywhere, it will affect America, that these choke points are sources of insecurity. Think about 2 years ago, I believe it was now, when that ship took a wrong turn in the Suez Canal and got stuck. Well, that disrupted global trade, including global trade in oil and gas, for a good few weeks. And that was just an accident. There are many of these: Straits of Malacca, Djibouti, the Gate of Tears. They're around the world. There are all sorts of these. Gibraltar would be another one. If through some natural disaster or enemy action, somebody starts shooting things as they go through these choke points, that is deemed to be a threat to American energy security. And I would note parenthetically that it's also viewed that way from Beijing, which is very dependent on Middle Eastern oil and gas. And to get from the Middle East across the Indian Ocean, through the Straits of Malacca, up into Shanghai and China's industrial East Coast, there are a number of these choke points, which they fear the United States or India or other adversaries could pinch off in order to put pressure on China over some issue or other. There's also, from an American perspective, there's China's attempt to, I don't want to overstate this because that's an easy trap to fall into, but China's attempt to dominate certain parts of the world. China's attempt to muscle into what had previously been American-friendly sources of energy. So, for example, take the Persian Gulf. All that oil there, the United States has been a player forever. There was a little bit of trouble in the 70s, but by and large, the United States has considered at least the Saudi and the Gulf Cooperation Council states to be on its side, and has tried very hard to isolate the regional bad guy, Iran. But now China is in the mix, has last year signed a strategic partnership with Iran, recently brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran to reopen their respective embassies, which have been closed for the past 6 or 7 years because they weren't getting along together. China is kind of muscling into the region in ways that reflect its need for energy security, its desire to make sure that it has secure access to Middle Eastern oil, But now that's brushing up against the United States' longstanding role as the dominant external power, the cornerstone balancer, as it were, in the region. So that's a threat. And then because we've redefined energy security to include renewables, solar and wind, we have left ourselves vulnerable to in energy security terms, because the minerals that are required to make solar panels or batteries, lithium, cadmium, all of those sorts of things, are first of all extraordinarily dirty when you mine them. There are plenty of these minerals in the US, but you'd never get a license to mine them because they are so, dirty is the best word, unhealthy, destructive of the environment. To mine these things is incredibly problematic. And that means that we have to import these because we don't seem to mind if the environmental destruction designed necessary for us to enjoy our solar power or our wind power or our batteries or any of the other green technologies which rely on these. They're called critical minerals or rare earth elements. We don't mind mining, we don't mind acquiring them in Africa because that's somebody else's problem. The problem is, though, that China is now positioning itself to become, first of all, the dominant manufacturer of green technologies. I think it's still the case that most solar panels are built in China, for example, but also to corner the market on these rare earth elements or critical minerals that are needed to build these renewable energy sources. So again, put it in the context of this struggle between the US and China, not quite the Cold War, but something almost like it. China explicitly and purposefully seeking to position itself as a leader when it comes to green technologies and to corner the market when it comes to these minerals. You can see from an American perspective, this looks like a threat to energy security. Another kind of threat is just, we might call it environmental extremism. I've tried to find a more neutral term for it, but the idea that that it's okay to take extraordinary measures to prevent a new pipeline from being opened or a new oil well from being developed or things like that. So that's in play in a way that wasn't true for most of the history I've just recounted. And then the final threat now is cyber war, the exploitation of the internet, et cetera, to disrupt sources of oil. Think about 2 years ago, I think now, when a Russian-backed hacker hacked the Colonial Pipeline and basically managed to turn it off. It's a little more complicated story than that, but managed to turn it off. The thin edge of the wedge, a kind of harbinger of things to come. If it's possible for either foreign states or state-affiliated private entities, organized crime, for example, to hack into a pipeline or an oil well, or heaven forbid, a nuclear reactor, because there's still plenty of those around, and disrupt the normal operations, hold them hostage, or just disrupt their operations, that's an obvious threat to energy security. So what has the American response been to these threats in this context, given this definition of energy security? 4 things, really. First is friendshoring. So sourcing as much oil, gas, critical minerals, rare earth elements, not just in the United States, but in reliable, friendly countries like Canada, for example. So friendshoring energy sources. Accelerate the transition to renewables. That's fraught, as I've just said, with all kinds of insecurities potentially. But if you pair that transition to renewables with a focus on green mining and processing of these rare earth elements, maybe that's a viable strategic response. You get wind and solar without all the messiness and environmental degradation and health threats that you get with mining of rare earth elements. And then the final piece is cybersecurity. If cyber war and hacking is a threat to American national security interests, then the obvious response is to tighten up cybersecurity and make sure that those facilities, pipelines, nuclear power plants, et cetera, aren't vulnerable to hacking in a way that they seem to have been, at least in that one instance. So that's the picture that I would paint of energy geopolitics since the Second World War, with a specific focus on energy security. It's a varied picture. The picture evolves and changes as the broader geopolitical context evolves, as the nature of the energy industry evolves. But no matter what those two things look like, there's always the question of how can we, the United States, ensure reliable and affordable access to energy. And with that, I'll draw my formal comments to a close and turn it over to Judy to quarterback the Q&A.
We do have a number of questions in the Q&A, but I believe we have space for plenty more. So yeah, now I will say to the audience, it's your turn to type your questions in. And I will start right away going down the Q&A column. First question, how many of the 32 plants of the Cold War are still running?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know. Some of them, I mean, nuclear power plants have a life cycle. They just don't last forever. And so they would be closed down. In a slightly different universe, you would open up a new one. But that's not happening. So there's a normal kind of attrition. Some of them, like 3 Mile Island, were closed down because they had a huge accident.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know the exact numbers, but I don't think it's a matter of purposefully closing down plants as much as it is we're not rebuilding. We're letting them run through their 30 or 40-year life cycle, and then that's it. They're dead.
Yeah. How do globalized energy corporations prioritize profit and national interests? And are all energy corporations globalized?
Well, they always put profit over national interest. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their stakeholders. They really don't have an option. They have to do what's going to maximize profit. Now, that's where states and governments step in. They can put regulations in place that force those corporations to do things that are in the national interest. And I'm not demonizing corporate executives. That's the way it works. You have a legal responsibility to maximize profits for your shareholders, and it doesn't really matter if it involves things that are questionable from a national security perspective. And as I said, that's where states step in. Remind me of the second part of the question, Judy.
The second part was, are all energy corporations globalized?
Oh, yes.
Are there any? Okay.
Yeah. So they come in at least two flavors. There's the entirely sort of privatized entities, and then there are the state-controlled or state entities. China's energy companies are, even if they're nominally independent these days, there is a Communist Party cell that sits on the board of directors. There's much more direct insertion of national interests into the calculation of Chinese energy companies than would be the case for the most part in Europe or the United States. Having said that, in Europe, there are still national champions. There are still energy companies that are at least partly state-owned. But again, they tend to operate on a profit maximizing basis. The short answer is then that almost all of these firms operate in a global marketplace. So if something happens in Indonesia, it doesn't just affect the price of oil in Indonesia, because the markets are all connected. It will affect the price of oil elsewhere as well. And then particular firms find their niches. Some are truly global and truly privatized. Some are, like in the Chinese case, national champions. Some are partly owned by governments, and governments can exert some influence over them. And there has been a movement in the last 4 or 5 years, but especially in the last 2 years, there has been a movement to decouple, to deglobalize, to reverse the globalization, because the sense this is an artifact of COVID and the pandemic, the idea that the United States economy is too integrated with the Chinese economy. And if something goes wrong there, COVID, that results in all kinds of shortages here in terms of, for example, I had to get some work done on my car at the height of COVID, and the technician said, luckily, this doesn't involve a transistor. Because if it involved a transistor, what's going to take me a week would take me 5 or 6 months. Right. So the idea is that kind of vulnerability in the energy sector is something that is not desirable. It doesn't lend itself to reliable access. So the friendshoring piece, the deglobalization piece, the decoupling piece, all of those are responses that work against this single global integrated market, which sounded really good in the 90s and 2000s. We loved globalization. Well, some people did anyway, loved globalization. And now there's a sense that there's too much vulnerability. We need to step back a little bit.
All right. Next questioner starts out by saying, excellent talk. Is China on a trajectory to become energy independent?
That's a good question. Energy independent the Chinese still burn a lot of coal. They don't have the aversion to it. But even that, they have huge domestic sources, but even that they import from Australia as well. So they want not energy independence in terms of all the energy being produced within the borders of China, but they want energy independence in that they are not vulnerable to the United States or its friends or allies turning off the taps, as it were. So they want to have relations with countries that are oil producers that are reliable. So, for example, their deal with Iran. Iran's facing all kinds of sanctions, has a hard time selling its oil. It's going to sell its oil to China. China's desperate for oil. It's going to run interference for Iran. It's great. They're actually, and not just Iran, but they're doing deals with Saudi Arabia as well to again, not independence, but energy security, reliable access. In a perfect world, from Beijing's perspective, they would have, lakes and lakes of oil and gas within the Chinese borders. They don't. So the next best thing is to make sure that they have guaranteed access beyond. And in that sense, I think energy security is probably the phrase I would use rather than energy independence. Having said that, though, again, in a slightly different universe, they would corner the market on all the renewable minerals, the rare earth elements and whatnot, that they would have an entirely solar, wind, and battery-based industry at home, and that they would have control over all of that. In that sense, there's a kind of aspiration to independence, but that's way, way off in the future.
Yeah. And that brings up the issue of rare earth elements, critical minerals. Are there, you explained that we do not mine them in this country, not because we don't have them, but because the mining conditions would be so onerous. Is there any effort to develop more viable mining technology with regard to these? There's a question here, is there going to be a shortage issue in the future? Will Africa run out, and will we be forced to turn to those methods in our own country? Could you talk a little bit more about that issue?
Yeah, I'm sure there are enterprising and entrepreneurial people, because this is a potential huge market. In the short to medium term, there's plenty in Africa, for example. There's plenty in Latin America, and this is the scary bit for me. There's plenty in the Arctic. And as the polar ice cap shrinks, and there's more and more access to both underwater, but also on land, more access, there's going to be some competition. And China's already muscling into the Arctic. It calls itself a near Arctic country. Now, if you look at a map, a globe, you have to really stretch the definition of near to China and near Arctic country. But they see that as the next frontier for hydrocarbons, oil and gas, but also rare earth elements. So
Mhm.
in the short to medium term, we're going to see more competition for limited sources. But again, rare earth elements are just not that rare. They're just very dirty to mine. So I've got to believe, I haven't seen any reports to this effect, but I've got to believe that in some garage or some basement somewhere, actually probably in some well-resourced lab at some big corporation, people are working on this, because in the medium to long term, not the short to medium to long term, that's obviously where we're going to go if we're going to pursue renewables.
What specifically is the problem with mining them now? I mean, you talk about terrible mining conditions. Does that mean it lays waste to the countryside? The miners all develop silicosis.
Both
What's
and
the problem?
both
Both
and
and I see.
it's kind of strip mining, that kind of thing.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
There's a lot of mining for very little. I guess maybe that's the rare part. So you've got to do a lot of mining to get very little of this stuff, and then it's just lethal.
Yes.
Cadmium. I mean, it's just horribly
Yeah.
adverse to one's health. Let's put it that way.
I
And then
see.
you've got to transport it and refine it and all of those kinds of things. Now we're an ingenious species. For better or for worse, right? We developed the H-bomb. That was really, really
Yeah.
ingenious. But we also
Yeah.
have health problems in the past. So
hmm
I think at some point, the financial pressures will be such that somebodies are really going to invest a lot of time, energy, and money in this. But in
Yeah.
that short to medium term window, the incentives really aren't there.
Okay. And now we have a questioner who kind of brings the issue down to the local level. The question is the mining proposed by Twin Metals in northern Minnesota tied to these important metals for green technology? And I'm sorry, I don't know anything about the Twin Metals issue. Perhaps you know more about that controversy than
I,
I do.
no, I don't know about that specific case.
Okay. All
I've,
right.
yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm sorry to that questioner. What does the maintenance of the renewable energy system look like? Does it require replacement of rare minerals in the system? Do we have a sense of the cost and the frequency? How often do you need these rare minerals? Is it an ongoing process, or do you just use them once to get things up and running?
Well, right now, if you've got an electric car, you've got a battery with tons of these things in it, not quite literally
Yeah.
tons, but a lot.
Yeah.
And that battery has a life cycle measured in years,
Mhm.
not decades. And when you're done, you get a new battery and probably don't think about too much what happens to the old battery. But the
Yeah.
old battery gets put on a ship and sent to someplace in Africa, because that's where we dump all our completely irredeemable garbage. I mean, there's nothing you can do with it. It's
Mhm.
dirty. Again, those metals leach out of the batteries over time into the soil, and et cetera, the water. It's really, and there's nothing you can do with those. They're not recyclable. They're done.
Yeah.
And that's just, I think, the most obvious example. It's not like you can take the lithium out of the batteries and put more lithium in. I mean, maybe down the road, that's an innovation. That's not what happens now. What happens is we swap it out and we dump that battery. It's got to be dumped somewhere, and not in my backyard.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Does the United States have a formal energy transition plan? Can we estimate the time needed to wean ourselves from fossil fuels?
Well, there's the various dates, 2035, 2050, about net zero, right? Which is not quite the same, but it's designed to create an incentive structure which gets people to think about something other than fossil fuels, hydrocarbons, which generate, carbon, the hydrocarbons that create climate change. The United States, as far as I know, the U.S. doesn't have a formal plan. It's got an incentive structure in place, but not a formal plan. I would be very surprised if the Department of Defense wasn't devoting considerable energy towards this, because even DOD is thinking about tanks and trucks and net zero and renewables, and how do you do that? And that's both because of the United States government's commitment to net zero by 2050, but also just the security elements of that. In a world in which
Mhm.
you can't have reliable access to oil and gas, it's not a good thing to have tanks that need oil and gas, right? You
Yeah.
need some other way of powering them. And so I'm sure there's
Mhm.
something going on in the Pentagon world. And that's been the case
Mhm.
historically. The Department of Defense has pioneered a lot of new technologies because they don't have to worry about cost to benefits and profits and loss. They just absorb the cost and make it work for national security
Mhm.
reasons.
Yeah.
Uh, but no, as far as I know, there's no formal step-by-step legally mandating plan to transition like that, just
Mhm.
incentives.
Okay. Could you see the Ukraine war resulting in the permanent withdrawal of Russian oil and gas from the world market? Well, let's say not withdrawal, but transference of Russian oil and gas from the world market to the Chinese market, to the Chinese domestic market.
Uh, yes, and so
Mhm.
what's happened over the last year plus since the war broke out? Uh, we in the West, appropriately, I think, decided we were going to sanction Russia economically.
Mhm.
And a big part of that was to sanction their oil industry, which is really the only moneymaker they have. They sell vodka, they sell weapons, they sell oil and gas. That's all the Russians have
Yeah.
to export. If you can
Okay.
shut one of those off, you can really twist their arm and get them to stop what they're doing in Ukraine. That's the logic.
Mhm.
Here's the problem. Most of the rest of the world thinks that this is just some pathetic European war. They're always fighting each other. They always have fought each other. We don't really care.
Mhm.
India is happily buying discounted Russian oil. India is now the largest country in the world in terms of
Mhm.
population. It overtook
Mhm.
China last year. It's industrializing and developing, and this is a boon. Discounted oil and gas, this is fantastic. China,
Mhm.
yes, the pipelines used to flow from Russia to Western Europe. Now they're beginning to build them so that there are already some that they flow to China,
Mhm.
because China too, why worry about choke points and the Suez Canal and all that when you can have a pipeline that goes from Russia straight to China? Perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of other countries that are trying to industrialize, are industrializing, look at this cheap Russian oil and gas and say, me too. Yes, please. We'd like some of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think we are definitely going, we've already seen, and we will see more. The Germans are a bit weird on this, but I can come back to that. We're seeing a reorientation of Russian oil and gas exports from the lucrative Western European market to other lucrative, maybe less lucrative, but still lucrative markets
Mhm.
around the world, especially China and India, but not just China and India. That's what we're likely to see. Now, the Germans, so the French, by the way, never acquired this allergy about nuclear energy, and most of their energy is not their cars, obviously, but most of their energy is generated by nuclear
Mhm.
power plants. They can keep
Mhm.
building them, and they love them, and they don't have this thing that we have about them. The Germans were more like us, and they began shutting down nuclear power plants until February 24th of last year, when the Russians
Mhm.
invaded. And they realized this was going to be complicated. So I think their last
Yeah.
three that they were going to shut off, they're
Mhm.
keeping them running now because they have energy security needs too.
Mhm.
Reliable and affordable energy. If we can't get it from Russia, which we were, we have to get it elsewhere. Some of it we can get from the Middle East, some of it from
Mhm.
Norway and what's left of the North Sea oil. But as a backstop, they kept their nuclear power plants running.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
we'll see how the Germans handle this in the long term.
What about the Middle East? What are the implications for the Middle East? Should Russia and China establish this firm sort of oil relationship? And in particular, what about implications for the Middle East conflict, the conflict that never dies?
Yeah. Well, Russia maintains a strong interest in the Middle East because there's something called OPEC Plus. So the original OPEC was really Middle Eastern countries. OPEC Plus includes Russia and a few others around the world. they have an interest in the Middle East because, once again, a globalized market. If the price of oil, let's say that the sanctions on Iran came off tomorrow and lots of Iranian oil comes on the market. Well, that's going to drive the price of oil down globally. And if you're relying on oil exports, the price goes down even more. That's not good. So they maintain an interest. The major conflict in the Middle East, as far as oil is concerned, has nothing to do with the Israelis and Palestinians. It has everything to do with Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Russia has hedged its bets there. It has been doing deals with the Saudis and works closely with the Saudis. It also, just a few months ago, did a deal with the Iranians. It's selling them some kinds of military technologies, and it's getting tons of drones from Iran, which it's using in Ukraine to prosecute its war. So, like China, unlike the United States, Russia is trying to curry favor with both Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Cooperation States because it wants to maintain, it doesn't need Middle Eastern oil, but it has an interest in what goes on in the Middle East. I suppose ideally from a Russian perspective, there'd be a big war in the Middle East. There'd be no more oil exports from the Middle East. The price of oil would go through the roof and they'd make lots of money. But that's a bit of a risky gamble on their part.
This is a little off topic, but what is the source of contention between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Is it Shia versus Sunni? What is the conflict?
It's partly theological, and for some Americans, that's like, what? They would fight about this? But no, this has got to do with culture and identity. They really don't get along, and that's part of a more complicated picture. I mean, there's an imperial picture. I know people in the West like to think that we invented empires and we're the only colonial powers, but guess what? The Persian Empire for a long time dominated the Arab states in the region and treated the Arabs not well. There's some historical things there. There's also, though, a very modern phenomenon, which is, if you look at a map, they're both the biggest and wealthiest and strongest states in the region. They both want, we could talk about the reasons. They both want to be the top dog, to dominate the region. Only one can be that. And so they're butting heads, and they're mobilizing allies. So it's like the American-Soviet Cold War. They can't fight directly, but they fight indirectly. So in Iraq, there are pro-Iranian forces and there are pro-Saudi forces, and they're fighting each other. Same is true in Syria. The same is true in Yemen, although there's a ceasefire there now. So it's a very complicated, it's overdetermined, the conflict. There's a lot of things that are pushing them against each other. And it's not easily resolved. The recent China brokered deal is kind of like détente in the 1970s between the Soviets and the Americans. It didn't resolve the underlying conflicts, but it was like, let's just take a break for 5 minutes. This is killing us. Right? So just it's a breather. I don't think it's anything more than that. But it is deeply embedded. The Saudis, and I'll just end on this this particular line of thought on this. The Saudis and the Gulf Cooperation Council states, which are in the Saudi camp, are so anti-Iranian, they're willing to form an alliance with Israel, whom the Iranians refer to as the little Satan. We're the great Satan. They're the little Satan, right? That's I've been teaching this course for a long time on Middle Eastern conflict and politics. If you were to tell me 10 years ago that the Gulf Cooperation Council states would be friendly with Israel, would recognize its right to exist, and blah blah blah, I would have said you're on something. That's never going to happen. And yet it has, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Israel's a powerful state, and so you can see how it's all shaking out.
Okay, well, back to energy. Thank you. Back to energy. This question has to do with batteries. Are batteries integral to the production of renewable solar and wind energy? Are there better, cleaner options? Could you do it somehow without batteries, without the use of these toxic, rare earth elements and so on?
Well, the wind does not always blow, and the sun is not always up. So you need a storage. You need some capacity to store energy when the wind is blowing and when the sun is up. And we call
Yeah.
those batteries.
Yeah.
Now, the question, I think, is what goes into the batteries to
Mhm.
store the energy. And right now, it's these rare earth elements that are what we have. And it's, as far as I know, unless there's something going on in some dark hidden lab somewhere, that's it.
Mhm.
My students sometimes I think of electricity as magic, that somehow you plug something into a wall and magically energy comes out. But that's not the case. You have to produce the energy somewhere. And then in the case of renewables, you have to store the energy somewhere. And when you think about that battery, where the stuff comes from, how far it has to be transported, and then when you get rid of it at the end of the day, the color green doesn't really come to mind for me. The color brown and this like sludge, that's what comes to mind. Now, again, we're an ingenious species. So down the road, when we're desperate enough, I think we'll probably find some fix. But for now, that's what batteries look like, and that's what they entail.
Okay. All right. Next questioner says, what strategies, and I will add, if any, are being pursued to establish and maintain friendly relations with China, including mutually beneficial competition without the threat of military conflict? I want to be in the world that this questioner is projecting here.
Don't we all?
Yeah.
The Biden administration, and this is more than just one administration, this has been brewing since the second Obama administration through Trump into Biden, has been a bit conflicted. On the one hand, we can't treat this like the Cold War. Back in the Cold War, like I said, the Soviets sold vodka to Americans, and that was it. The Chinese and American economies are like this. You can't go into any store in the United States and not find half the things made in China. It's that and American investment in China. I mean, the two economies are completely integrated. So on the one hand, we're not going to get, I don't think, a completely full-blown Cold War in which there's two completely distinct camps. They're in conflict with one another. The prospect of nuclear Armageddon hangs over our heads, Cuban Missile Crisis, all that kind of, I don't think we're going there. On the other hand, China is, as it's become more muscular and more powerful, it's got its elbows out. It's doing what big states always do. It's trying to get its own way on the world stage. The United States is so used to getting its own way since the end of the Cold War. Now, China wants to rewrite the rules so that they look more Chinese. It wants to, and you can see that this is causing this clash. The Biden administration periodically layers on top of that structural clash this language: democracies versus autocracies. China being a bad autocracy, we being good democracy. Well, that's kind of Cold War-ish, right? And if that gets traction and people really begin thinking about geopolitics and international relations in terms of autocracies and democracies, they can't get along together, Cold War, containment, all of that, then that gets very dangerous. To its credit, I think the Biden administration has walked a very fine line thus far. Engagement where possible, confrontation where necessary. And the big sticking point right now is Taiwan. And today, she might have left by now, but the president of Taiwan was here yesterday talking to McCarthy and whatnot. So that's where the test comes, because China desperately wants Taiwan back for all kinds of historical and geopolitical reasons. The Taiwanese don't want to be incorporated into the mainland communist China. American policy is, you two sort it out on your own, but it has to be peaceful. And we'll make sure, Taiwan Relations Act that we passed in 1979, will make sure that Taiwan has the ability to defend itself. And that's where this engagement and confrontation and rough balance, it all looks good. That's where it might not be sustainable, and where it might be, without overdrawing the parallel, Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0 kind of thing. No, we in this group know that was a near-run thing. Next questioner wonders if it's time to take another look at nuclear power.
This person says, do you see a future rise in permitting and development of nuclear power out of a need that arises because other alternatives won't be able to meet our demands?
Yes. Yes, there's all kinds of innovations taking place in that industry, micro reactors that are relatively small, can fit in my office kind of thing. There's lots of innovation there in terms of reusing the fuel so that it comes out at the end, it's not terribly radioactive. There's still lots of issues and problems, but there's lots of innovation taking there. And you can see why it, there were a couple of movies that came out in the 70s that were really anti-nuclear. And then there was the Chernobyl and Fukushima and 3 Mile Island. This just scared people. Almost, it's not irrational, but at a sub-rational level. It's just a gut feeling like, no, nukes are bad. But the new nuclear reactors are, well, first of all, it has to be said that 3 Mile Island worked. All the safeguards kicked in and the thing didn't melt down. I mean, that's what was supposed to happen happened. But I don't want to gloss over that. What I want to say is that lots of innovations now, because I think a lot of people, not a majority, but a lot of people are looking at that and saying, maybe we need to give that a second look because it's relatively safe, relatively clean, relatively affordable, relatively reliable, and it seems to solve a lot of the energy security problems and challenges that we face. Why not pursue it? But I do think there's this cultural gut reaction that we'll have to overcome at some point if that's going to happen. I do not own any shares in any nuclear power company. I'm just reporting the facts, as it were.
Okay. All right. All right. And now this questioner says, it seems all of the alternatives to energy have negative consequences. How about conservation and simply relying less on energy altogether? Is that an impossible goal?
No, it's not an impossible. I mean, there are always trade-offs. The first comment is absolutely bang on. There's always a downside to any of these things, and it's a matter of costs and benefits and how you do the trade-off there. So I think that's true. Conservation, you still need to produce energy to conserve it. So yes, conservation has been a thing since the 70s too, right? Turn off your lights. And I've got teenage kids and they didn't get the memo because they never turn off the lights. No, but right. Or the new slightly problematic LED bulbs.
Yes.
Again, think about how you have to dispose of them. You're not supposed to put them in your garbage can when they're done because they're full of chemicals and minerals. Well, there's a special disposal for them. But basically, yes, you have to produce X amount of energy, but if you consume X minus Y, if you just consume less of it, it stands to reason. You don't have to produce as much. But if you push it to its extreme, you can't conserve what hasn't been produced. So it's a partial fix, a good thing. And I don't know if anybody who thinks it's a bad thing, except the energy producers who want to sell more. But it is not in and of itself a fix. It's part of a mitigation strategy.
All right. Question, why did the Saudis recently cut oil production? Do you know the reason for that?
Money. So that's the simple answer, right? It's if you cut supply and demand, you cut production, the price goes up, you get more revenue. But there's something else going on there as well. The Biden administration, President Biden himself, when he came to power, he had a real bee in his bonnet about the Saudis. He had his bee in his bonnet because Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, who's running the show, basically, on his watch, there was the Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist. There was, Biden came into power wagging his finger and scolding the Saudis because they didn't allow women to drive, which they now do. But and that they were conducting an inhumane war in Yemen using American military technology, and that he threatened to cut that off. And so this relationship that's been in place since 1945 has had its rocky periods, 1973, 74. This is another one because the U.S. has been, the Biden administration in particular has really been scolding and excoriating and demeaning the Saudis in ways that when President Biden went to Saudi Arabia, was it last year, the year before, and said, can you increase production so that the price will go down?
Mhm.
Crown Prince basically told him to pound sand. I mean, go away.
Mhm.
What have you done for me lately? Nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's partly economics, but there's also a geopolitical overlay, and there's also personalities. I just think those two guys don't get
Mhm.
along.
But how can the Saudis not expect to be excoriated when they go around cutting, opposition voices like Khashoggi literally to pieces?
Well, from an American president's perspective, I think you have to make a choice. Do
Mhm.
you want to be that stern grandmother, right? Shaking of the finger. I had one of those. I know what it's like. Or do you want to say to yourself, look, we need the Saudis. It's none of our business. Let's keep our mouth shut today. That's the fundamental choice. Are we going to do business with unsavory regimes around the world? Or are we going to put on our Boy Scout cap, pretend that we're perfect, which the last time I checked, we're not, and go around telling people that what they're doing is wrong and immoral, even if it is, right? It's the art of diplomacy. And I think in this particular instance, without judging the Biden administration across the board, I think in this particular instance, picking a fight with MBS, as he's called, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, seems to have been a bit of a misstep.
Okay. All right. How close are we to hardening our major distribution points of electricity from bad actors? I have read that hostilities on only 9 of these strategic energy distribution points could close down nearly 100% of our electricity and everything and related industries. Could you comment on this?
Yeah. Well, it's a bit of a sword and shield dynamic, by which I mean, you build one of these facilities and you put in place some basic shielding to keep the hackers out and even physical attacks, right? You have physical security.
Yeah.
And then the bad guys figure a way to partly get around that. And then you build a better shield, and then they build a better sword and shield and sword. So it's an unending race, I think. And it is the case, though, that the industry is very well aware of the vulnerabilities. And by vulnerabilities, I don't just mean like they could somehow shut off a spigot somewhere and stop the flow of oil. What they often do instead is they hack into your personnel files and all your other business files. They download them, steal them from you, and they say, if you want to do business, if you want all these documents back, you got to pay us $1 billion or whatever the case might be.
Yeah.
And until you do that, you can't really do business. And so the oil stops flowing and whatnot. So there are multiple points of vulnerability in all of this. And again, it's this sword and shield dialectic that, and it's not going to end. And let's just hope that the good guys stay on the winning side of that, because it won't take much. That one Colonial Pipeline thing, the gas stations closed on the East Coast, prices skyrocketed on the East. I mean, and that was one little thing. Imagine if you were to shut down all of the electricity and pick your favorite city, St. Paul. But New York, Chicago, what a disaster that would be. Imagine if all the traffic lights in the Twin Cities turned green at the same time.
Yeah.
It would be a nightmare, even worse than on an unusual day.
Right. Okay. Do U.S. sanctions have any real effect on the global energy markets?
Less than the administration hoped. So sanctions, we put sanctions on the 2 countries that are on everybody's radar, Iran and Russia. And the maximum pressure campaign that Donald Trump launched when he was in the White House has really hurt Iran. Their economy has basically collapsed. Now, what has been the strategic effect of that? Have they cried uncle and said, we give up? No, not at all. What they've done is said, China, can you help us? Right? Russia, can you help us? So sanctions can have a an obvious short, medium-term economic impact. Sometimes they don't appear to have had much impact on Russia, by the way. I mean, McDonald's closed down, but they just reopened them all as O'Donnell's or something. But the real question is, are sanctions a tool of statecraft that allow you to get the political outcome that you want? And there's a huge literature on this, and the answer is maybe sometimes, but mostly no.
Yeah.
Mostly they don't work.
Okay. All right. And now one of our very knowledgeable viewers has weighed in. We drew a blank on twin metals. And this person says, twin metals focused on designing, constructing, and operating an underground copper, nickel, cobalt, and platinum group metals mine. The mine to be located 9 miles southeast of Ely and 11 miles northeast of Babbitt in greater Minnesota. So are any of those metals, copper, nickel, cobalt, and platinum, are any of those in that group of rare earth metals?
Cobalt might be. Cobalt's a kind of dangerous thing, and I'm not sure if it's a rare earth element. I don't think it is, but it's more problematic than platinum.
Yeah. Okay. I see there were several of our audience who responded on that point. Thank you to everyone who stepped in there. So could you argue that the waste of batteries is worse than nuclear power waste? Is that an arguable position?
I think it is. Yeah. Again, so costs and benefits, trade-offs, we don't live in a perfect world. If you want your lights to come on, you need energy. It's a question of how and where you get it. And so the batteries and the renewables sound good and are very promising in the future. But right now, when I think of mining, when I think of you got to put the minerals on a ship and you got to sail it on all the carbon footprint of that, and then you've got to assemble it and then it does its job and it seems pretty clean for a while, and then you got to dispose of it, and you're not going to dispose of it in your backyard. It'll be put on a truck and then on a ship and then sent off. And of course, we always dump our garbage somewhere else in the world. When I put all of that together, like I said, it doesn't look like a very green technology. Promising to be, and makes us feel really good at the point of consumption because it's pretty clean at the point of consumption.
Yeah.
But when you think of the before and after, it's not. Now you think about nuclear and you think, okay, you got to mine that stuff too, by the way, but that's pretty mature technology. It's not like mining the rare earths to get uranium out of the ground. We know how to build them. We know how to put the safeguards in place. Could something go catastrophically wrong? Well, yeah, we know that Chernobyl, but here's what I would say about that. Likening Chernobyl to American nuclear reactors is like likening a Soviet supermarket to an American supermarket. I mean, they're apples and oranges. They're totally different things. They didn't design any safeguards into that Chernobyl thing.
Yeah.
No wonder. Okay, so but there's always a danger and there's always a risk. That's the trade-off part. My sense is that the way that the nuclear industry is evolving, that industry at this moment and for the foreseeable future is cleaner, more reliable, and more affordable than some of these green technologies, the renewables. Doesn't mean that's going to be the case in 10 or 20 years, but that's the case right now. You can't get there. The other issue with nuclear, of course, is that the same technology that is used to make peaceful nuclear reactors can be used to make nuclear weapons, which is what we found in Iran. They're very close. They're like, they could have enough fissile material, uranium, to make a bomb in about 2 weeks. That's their breakout time. Then they'd have to put it in a bomb and all the rest of it. But that's a real concern as well. You can trust some countries, Canada, Japan, they have nuclear industries and they don't have nuclear weapons. They could, but they're not going. Well, Japan. But then there are other countries. Israel started out with a nuclear power industry, and then because of its geopolitical situation, we'd like nuclear weapons, and guess what? Now they have nuclear weapons. Iran is the same. So that's another part of the nuclear equation that doesn't apply to lithium batteries, for example. You can't turn a lithium battery into a nuclear weapon of mass destruction. So trade-offs.
You mentioned earlier that France had failed to get the anti-nuclear message. Why is their situation different? What happened or did not happen in France that made them accept nuclear power?
Well, the
Continue
short,
to
the
accept it.
short answer is they're French. The slightly longer answer is it's just different. And it's different in Germany. The Germans, as I said, really did get
Mhm.
this. Um, it's a profound sociological question. Like, what's different about French culture? It just didn't resonate for whatever reason. They saw Chernobyl. It was closer to them than it was to us. They
Yeah.
read about 3 Mile Island and even Fukushima. There is a small anti-nuclear movement in France. I mean, it's a diverse country in all sorts of ways. But the government, with the support of the broad mass of people, has just never felt the need to turn these things off. Partly because it too was scarred by 1973. I mean, it was
Yes.
French had their oil cut off as well. And I think they just resolved they weren't going to find themselves in that situation ever again, and
Mhm.
built this nuclear industry, probably with a very powerful lobby attached to it, right,
Mhm.
in Paris. And they're not interested in denuclearizing.
And is their safety record good? Is it better than other places with regard to the nuclear power industry?
I don't believe there's ever been anything like 3 Mile Island in France.
Mhm.
Certainly, I mean, Chernobyl was a one-off thing. Nowhere in the world have we seen anything like
Yeah.
that. Fukushima is more scary because that was an earthquake and a tidal wave. That wasn't
Yes.
anything to do with the plant itself. And that could happen anywhere. So, the French aren't building their nuclear power plants on fault lines because they don't have any. It's not prone. It's different political culture, different political decisions, and a different political outcome.
Yeah. I think we've got time for just one last question. I apologize. I know we have many, many questions still in the Q&A line, and I really apologize because these are all excellent questions. Could the nuclear oil shutdown, the oil crisis of 1973, could that have been perceived as a sanction on us? Was that direct in, and could that happen again? Or is the the oil industry too, it's no longer localized to the Middle East in the same way?
No, it was very much sanctions. It's a perfect analogy. That's we're going to put economic pressure on you to get you to change your political approach. And could it happen again? OPEC plus. I mean, you would have to get all of the major producers on board, and one can imagine a scenario in which they would attempt to put pressure. We couldn't do that to the Russians, for example, but one could imagine a situation in which the Russians, the Saudis, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, and there's more, Venezuela would have to be in the mix.
Yeah.
Lots of producers. But if you get the main producers in the mix, they could get together and say, we're not selling any oil to you. Or what they more typically do routinely is, let's cut production. Cutting production raises the price, raises their profit margin, but can also be used to put pressure on. So when President Biden, this is related, when President Biden goes to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia and says, can you please increase production? And they say no. That's not quite a sanction, but it's in the family, right, of sanction.
Sure.
About how to put political pressure on.
Yeah. I'm so sorry we are out of time. This has been a most interesting discussion. I want to thank our speaker, Andrew Latham. Thanks to Grayson and Carmi behind the scenes. Thank you so much to the audience. We spent half the time on audience questions, and we couldn't have done that if you hadn't come up with such really interesting and excellent questions. I hope everyone will come back next week when we will have another old friend who's spoken to this audience many times before. Todd Lefko will return, speaking on the topic of economic warfare. That should be very interesting, and we look forward to seeing all of you next week. But for today, I'm going to say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.